Graveyards are complicated places. They're obviously associated with pain and suffering. We come here to bury our loved ones and then remember them after they've passed on. But they're also at the same time a connection to the distant past. This graveyard here outside Waterford is at a place called Lisnakill, and it stretches back to the Middle Ages. It might be over 1,000 years old. So generation after generation, people have come here to bury their dead. And you get a sense of generations past through their tombstones, through the church in which they once worshipped. But in this video, I want to bring you to a tomb that takes us way further back. There's a dolmen, or portal tomb, not far from here at a place called Gallstown, and that was erected 5,000 years ago. So I'm going to bring you over there now, and we're going to look at that tomb and see what it reveals about an Ireland that is long gone from the landscape.
Please pray when all you feel is you don't know. Please stay if you believe in tomorrow. Please stay.
So I've just cycled a couple of 100 metres. I hope you can hear me. It's a pretty windy day here. But we're going to go up and look at a 5,000-year-old tomb. And one of the interesting things about going to see something this old is that it's always, or nearly always, off the beaten track. So even if you go to, say, like we were in there, a medieval graveyard, you know, modern roads usually follow a similar path to medieval ones, and they're easy to find in the landscape. But when you go back 5,000 years, you're in a completely different world. So roads, obviously, that exist today, or even in the medieval period, didn't exist then. So to get to Gallstown Dolmen, I came down a country lane, you saw it there on the video. But then you have to come off that lane, and then you walk up what is now a private road. Thankfully, the local property owners make the dolmen accessible. And then after that, you have to go down a kind of a narrow path through some trees to see the dolmen. So in total, I've walked about 150 metres off the road, and I've arrived at the dolmen here, which you can see behind me. And I'm just going to walk up to it so you get a sense of perspective. So I'm about 2 metres tall, so you can see it's a really impressive structure. And just to explain to you what it looked like at the time, so you've got this huge capstone here, probably weighs over 100 tons. It's pretty incredible how they got that up there. I'll explain that in a minute. And then there's 6 upright stones, 3 of which support this huge capstone. Now, it's thought that when this was built 5,000 years ago, they would have first erected the upright stones, then a mound of earth up against the side, and pushed the capstone into place with rollers. But it wouldn't have looked like this back when it was first erected. Most archaeologists and historians, or most archaeologists rather, agreed that it would have been covered with a mound of stone or earth, and there would have been a passageway of sorts into a chamber underneath this capstone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that chamber next and explain to you what this was used for. So this is a view of the tomb from a different angle, and you can see this is the capstone above me again, but there is a chamber formed by the upright stones and the capstone overhead. And it was in this chamber where back in the Neolithic, or just on the threshold of the Neolithic, the early Neolithic, as farming starts to take hold in Ireland, that this was erected to bury the dead. And we know from excavations at other portal tombs like this, when I say portal tomb, that means the same as dolmen, but we know from excavations at other tombs that these were used to inter the remains of people. Now, you'd have to imagine they're obviously going to be people of very high status. Building something like this 5,000 years ago wasn't easy, but also even the numbers of people that have been found in tombs like this is tiny. So the population of Ireland during this period, the Neolithic, when this was first erected, was about 100, 150,000 people. And it lasted for about 1,000 or 1,500 years. And through the entire span of that period, we only have the remains of 1,000 people who lived through that, which is quite remarkable. So only a tiny, tiny percentage of people who lived during the Neolithic survive, or the remains survive up to the present. So these tombs are obviously for a tiny elite in society. But what's really interesting about these is that they're not just used to bury the dead. It's thought as well they were kind of a repository of memory, and maybe I'll talk about that. I'll bring you show you more closer into the passage, and I'll talk a little bit about how they were used as a repository of memory back in the Stone Age. Okay, so here you can kind of get a better sense of the chamber itself, and archaeologists hypothesize, I suppose, that's all you can do when you're talking about a society 5,000 years ago, but they hypothesize that the people who were buried here, or this was not just erected, I suppose, to bury people, but also for the society that lived around this tomb. They would have come here, maybe for generations, to remember stories of the dead. You know, don't forget, this is an oral society. That means they have no written word, no written record. So coming here, telling stories of the dead in the place that they were buried would have made this almost like it's almost like a library or a repository of memory. Now, this tomb obviously fell out of use, or certainly wasn't used in the way it was first erected, because you can see the stone is gone from the side of the building. It's now exposed to the elements. But I think this tomb was probably abandoned for a very long time. And then possibly in the 19th century, people started to reuse or reattach spiritual meaning to this tomb. And the reason I suspect this is because of this hill that's beside the tomb here. Now that today is known as Hill of the Hag. You know, that's the idea of a hag or a witch, has a kind of a supernatural, a spiritual attachment to this place. But that name is actually only a relatively recent invention. So in the 1840s, records show that this was called Cnoch an Gálig, which is Gallstown Hill, which is Gallstown is the surrounding area. And then in the aftermath of the Great Hunger, that name seems to have been corrupted to Hill of the Hag, which in Irish would have been Cnoch an Gaillich. But that might indicate that people were starting to reattach some level of spiritual or supernatural attachments to this tomb. And what's pretty incredible today is that people do come here to carry out rituals, and they leave offerings here. I don't really know what those beliefs around that are. Obviously, it's very different from the belief systems of the people who first built this, but still it is a spiritual place, or it's a place that people attach meaning to. Now, just one final thing, you might wonder, what did the people who believed this, or what did the people who erected this believe in? What was their belief system? We don't really know much. Obviously, as I say, it's about 5,000 years since this was built. But that hill, Cnoch an Gaillich or Cnoch an Gálig, behind me might have some insight into it. So you'll often find dolmens close to hills. There's another one not far from here at a place called Knockeen, beside a small hill. That's what the word Knockeen means. And possibly, just possibly, in the period when this was erected back 5,000 years ago, it's very likely that the sun carried a very important and spiritual meaning for the people. Like they may have been, to put it crudely, sun worshippers. Obviously the sun was so important in a society like that. And places like hills would have gained an importance in a society like that, because you obviously want to get access to the sun, to see the sun, and if you live in a society or in an Ireland that would have been heavily forested, that wouldn't be as easy as it is today. Now that's me just speculating. Obviously it was used to bury the dead. Why it was erected here, we can only guess, and I think it probably is related to that hill. But if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear your view. Leave a comment below. And just last thing I'll say is, if you want to find out more about this, I have a podcast. It's called Exploring a 5,000-Year-Old Tomb, where I explore this dolmen and another one in much greater detail. Finally, if you're enjoying these videos, please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. You'll get a notification when the next video comes out.